I looked up at the courthouse steps, my hands trembling as I clutched the manila envelope containing all the evidence that would finally bring him down. 3 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be testifying against the man I once loved, the man who became my stepfather, the man who murdered my mother, I would have laughed. But here I am, and this is my story. My name is Sarah, and I'm 25 years old. This nightmare began when I was 22, fresh out of college and completely naive about the world. I had been dating Marcus for about 8 months. He was charming, handsome, and seemed to understand me in ways no one else ever had. Marcus was 31, older and more sophisticated than the college boys I was used to. He had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the world when he looked at me. We met at a coffee shop near campus where I was studying for my final exams. He bought my coffee and we talked for hours about books, travel, dreams. It felt like fate. Marcus told me he worked in finance, though he was always vague about the details. He dressed well, drove a nice car, and always seemed to have money for expensive dinners and weekend getaways. I was completely smitten. My mother, Helen, had raised me as a single parent after my father died when I was 12. She had worked incredibly hard to give me everything I needed, putting herself through nursing school while raising me, and eventually becoming a successful nurse practitioner. She had never remarried, always saying she was too busy focusing on my future to worry about her own love life. When I brought Marcus home to meet my mother for the first time, I was nervous but excited. I wanted her approval so badly. My mother was 53 then, still absolutely beautiful with her auburn hair and warm brown eyes. She had always been the strongest person I knew, independent and fierce, but also incredibly kind. She had recently inherited a substantial amount of money from my grandmother's estate, including the family home and some valuable investments. It was life-changing money, enough that she could retire early if she wanted to. I remember that first dinner so clearly. Marcus was at his most charming, asking my mother thoughtful questions about her work, complimenting her cooking, and sharing stories that had both of us laughing. He seemed genuinely interested in her life, her experiences as a single mother, her plans for the future. My mother later told me she thought he was wonderful, so mature and respectful. I was over the moon that they got along so well. But something changed after that dinner. Marcus started asking me more questions about my mother. At first, it seemed natural, like he was just trying to get to know my family better. He'd ask about her work schedule, her friends, whether she was dating anyone. He seemed particularly interested when I mentioned the inheritance, asking casual questions about the house, the investments, how my grandmother had accumulated so much wealth. I thought he was just making conversation, maybe even thinking long-term about our future together. Then Marcus started suggesting we spend more time at my mother's house. He said he loved how cozy it was, how welcoming my mother was to him. He began showing up there even when I was at work or busy with other things, claiming he wanted to help my mother with yard work or home repairs. My mother was charmed by his helpfulness and attention. She started calling him her honorary son, joking that she had finally found the son she never had. I started noticing that Marcus would ask me to change our plans if they conflicted with times when my mother would be home alone. He always had reasonable explanations, but looking back, the pattern was clear. He was systematically building a relationship with my mother that was separate from his relationship with me. When I'd come home and find them chatting over coffee or working together in the garden, they'd both light up and include me in their conversation, but there was an easy intimacy between them that made me feel like the outsider in my own family. About 6 months into our relationship, Marcus started pulling away from me. Our conversations became less frequent, our dates less romantic. He was always tired or stressed about work. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd reassure me that everything was fine, that he was just going through a difficult time at his job. He suggested we take a break from the physical side of our relationship, claiming he needed to focus on his career for a while. I was hurt and confused, but I loved him and wanted to be supportive. During this time, he was spending even more time at my mother's house. She started mentioning him constantly in our conversations. Marcus helped her reorganize her finances. Marcus suggested she update her will. Marcus thought she should consider some home renovations that would increase the property value. It seemed like every decision she made was somehow influenced by his input. When I expressed concern that she might be relying on him too much, she laughed it off, saying he was just being helpful and that I should be grateful to have such a caring boyfriend. Then came the bomb. 8 months after I introduced them, my mother called me with news that left me speechless. She and Marcus had fallen in love. She was crying as she told me, apologizing over and over, saying she never meant for it to happen but that they couldn't fight their feelings anymore. She said Marcus had been struggling with his emotions for months, torn between his loyalty to me and his growing love for her. They had decided to be honest rather than sneak around behind my back. I was devastated. The two people I loved most in the world had betrayed me in the worst possible way. Marcus came to see me that same day, looking appropriately tortured and remorseful. He said he had tried to fight his feelings but that what he and my mother had was real love, the kind that comes once in a lifetime. He claimed he had never experienced anything like it before, that what we had was special but this was something deeper. He promised they would wait to be together publicly until I had time to process and hopefully give them my blessing. I was so hurt and angry that I could barely think straight. I told them both that I needed time and space to figure out how to handle this situation. My mother kept calling, begging me to understand, saying she had been lonely for so long and that Marcus had shown her what it felt like to be truly cherished. She promised that their relationship wouldn't change how much she loved me, that I would always be her first priority. For weeks, I avoided both of them. I threw myself into work and spent time with friends who were just as shocked as I was by this turn of events. Everyone kept telling me how weird and inappropriate the situation was, but also that I couldn't control who my mother fell in love with. Some friends suggested that maybe Marcus had planned this from the beginning, but I dismissed those concerns as paranoia born from my hurt feelings. Eventually, my mother wore me down. She kept reaching out, sending flowers, leaving voicemails where she'd cry and beg me not to let this destroy our relationship. She emphasized that she had never been happier and that Marcus made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt since my father died. She said life was short and unpredictable, and that she couldn't pass up this chance at love. Against my better judgment, I agreed to have dinner with both of them. That dinner was one of the most awkward experiences of my life. Marcus was subdued and respectful, clearly trying not to be too affectionate with my mother in front of me. My mother was nervous and chatty, overcompensating for the tension by talking constantly about neutral topics. But I could see the way they looked at each other, the small touches, the inside jokes. It was real, whatever was between them, and seeing it made me feel sick and sad and confused all at once. Over the following months, I slowly began to accept their relationship. My mother seemed genuinely happy, lighter and more carefree than I had seen her in years. Marcus appeared devoted to her, constantly bringing her flowers, planning romantic gestures, talking about their future together. They moved slowly out of respect for my feelings, but by the 1-year mark, Marcus had essentially moved into my mother's house and they were talking about marriage. The engagement announcement came on my mother's 55th birthday. Marcus had planned an elaborate surprise party with all her friends and colleagues, and he proposed in front of everyone. The ring was gorgeous, clearly expensive, and my mother was radiant as she said yes. I forced myself to smile and hug them both, but inside I felt hollow. I kept thinking about how this should have been my engagement party someday, how Marcus was supposed to be proposing to me. They married 6 months later in a beautiful ceremony in my mother's garden. She wore a stunning dress that Marcus had helped her choose, and he looked handsome in his perfectly tailored suit. I was her maid of honor, a role that felt surreal and painful but that I couldn't refuse without causing a permanent rift in our relationship. During the ceremony, as I watched Marcus slip the wedding ring onto my mother's finger, I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. The first year of their marriage seemed blissful. My mother was glowing, always talking about the trips Marcus was planning for them, the ways he was helping her redecorate the house, his suggestions for managing her investments. Marcus had quit his finance job and was now managing my mother's financial affairs full-time, which she said was wonderful because it meant they could spend all their time together. He had convinced her to put his name on several of her accounts and to update her will to make him the primary beneficiary, with provisions for me as well, of course. I had started dating someone new, a kind and stable man named David, who helped me begin to heal from the trauma of losing Marcus and the ongoing weirdness of having him as a stepfather. David was patient with my complicated family situation, though he always said there was something about Marcus that bothered him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt like Marcus was performing all the time, like his devotion to my mother was somehow calculated rather than genuine. About 18 months into the marriage, I started noticing changes in my mother. She seemed tired more often, complaining of headaches and stomach problems. She had always been incredibly healthy and energetic, so these new symptoms were concerning. When I suggested she see a doctor, she said Marcus was taking good care of her and that she was probably just dealing with stress from some changes he was making to her investment portfolio. Marcus had convinced my mother to make some aggressive financial moves that he claimed would significantly increase her wealth. He had her pull money out of conservative investments and put it into riskier ventures that he said his contacts in finance had recommended. My mother trusted him completely and signed whatever documents he put in front of her. When I expressed concern about these changes, Marcus would patiently explain the strategy in terms that sounded reasonable but that I didn't fully understand. The symptoms got worse. My mother started losing weight and seemed confused sometimes, forgetting conversations we had just had or repeating herself in ways that were completely unlike her. Her hands would shake occasionally, and she complained of feeling dizzy. Marcus was very attentive, always by her side, monitoring her food and medication, insisting that she didn't need to see a doctor because he was taking such good care of her. One evening when I stopped by for dinner, I found my mother in bed, looking pale and weak. Marcus explained that she had been having a particularly bad day, that her symptoms were getting worse despite his care. He seemed genuinely worried and devoted, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, speaking to her in soft, loving tones. But something about the scene bothered me, though I couldn't identify what it was. That night, my mother was rushed to the emergency room with severe symptoms that the doctors initially couldn't identify. Marcus was frantic, crying and pacing in the waiting room, demanding that the medical team do everything possible to help her. The doctors ran numerous tests but couldn't find a clear cause for her condition. Her symptoms suggested some kind of poisoning, but they couldn't identify the source or the substance. My mother spent 2 weeks in the hospital, with Marcus never leaving her side. He slept in the chair next to her bed, brought her favorite foods when she could eat, and coordinated with all her doctors. To everyone watching, he was the perfect, devoted husband facing his worst nightmare. The medical team was impressed by his dedication and knowledge of her condition. But my mother didn't get better. Despite the hospital's best efforts, her condition continued to deteriorate. She would have brief periods of clarity where she seemed like herself, but most of the time she was weak, confused, and in pain. During one of her clear moments, she grabbed my hand and told me how lucky she was to have Marcus, how he had given her the happiest years of her life, and how I needed to take care of him if anything happened to her. My mother died on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after her symptoms first appeared. Marcus was holding her hand when she passed, and his grief seemed absolutely genuine. He collapsed against me, sobbing, saying he couldn't imagine life without her. The funeral was beautiful, and Marcus gave a heartbreaking eulogy about how my mother had saved him from loneliness and shown him what true love looked like. In the weeks following her death, Marcus and I leaned on each other in our shared grief. He was kind and supportive, helping me make arrangements and handle all the legal matters. He insisted that I take anything from the house that had sentimental value, saying that my mother would want me to have those memories. He seemed broken by her loss, sometimes calling me in the middle of the night just to talk about her, to share memories, to cry together. About 2 months after the funeral, Marcus asked me to meet him for coffee. He said he had something important to discuss with me. I assumed it was about settling my mother's estate or perhaps his plans to sell the house. Instead, he told me that he had been doing a lot of thinking about life and love and second chances. He said that losing my mother had made him realize how precious and unpredictable life was, and how important it was not to waste opportunities for happiness. Then he told me that he had never stopped loving me. He said that what he felt for my mother was real and meaningful, but that his love for me had never died. He claimed that being married to my mother had made him understand that I was the one he was truly meant to be with, that my mother had been a wonderful chapter in his life but that I was his future. He said he knew it was complicated and probably seemed inappropriate so soon after my mother's death, but that he couldn't bear the thought of losing me again. I was stunned. The idea of being romantically involved with my dead mother's husband felt wrong on every possible level. But Marcus was persistent, saying that my mother would want us both to be happy, that she had often mentioned how much she hoped Marcus and I could repair our friendship. He suggested that maybe we could start slowly, just as friends, and see if the love we once shared could be rekindled. I told him I needed time to think, that the whole situation felt too strange and painful to consider. But Marcus kept reaching out, sending flowers, leaving sweet voicemails, showing up at my apartment with takeout from my favorite restaurant. He was patient and understanding, never pushing too hard, but consistently present in my life. He talked about how much my mother had loved us both, how she would want us to find comfort in each other, how our love story could be beautiful if we were brave enough to pursue it. David, my boyfriend, was horrified by Marcus's pursuit and my conflicted feelings about it. He pointed out how manipulative and inappropriate the whole situation was, how Marcus had essentially groomed my mother and was now trying to do the same thing to me. But I was grieving and confused, and Marcus's attention felt like a lifeline in my loneliness. When David gave me an ultimatum about cutting contact with Marcus, I chose Marcus, convincing myself that David just didn't understand the complexity of my situation. 3 months after my mother's death, I agreed to have dinner with Marcus. He had been so supportive during my grief, so understanding about my conflicted feelings, and I was desperately lonely without my mother. That dinner led to another, and then to long walks where we talked about my mother and our shared memories. Marcus was careful not to rush things physically, but he was building an emotional intimacy that felt both comforting and deeply wrong. It was during one of these conversations that Marcus made a comment that stopped me cold. We were talking about my mother's final weeks, and he mentioned how difficult it had been to watch her suffer, how he had wished there was more he could do to help her. Then he said something about how at least she hadn't suffered for too long, how merciful it was that her decline had been relatively quick. The way he said it, with this odd sense of satisfaction, made something click in my brain. I started thinking about my mother's symptoms, how sudden they had been, how the doctors had suspected poisoning but couldn't identify the source. I remembered how Marcus had been managing her food and medications, how he had discouraged her from seeing doctors until it was too late. I thought about his extensive knowledge of her condition, his calm presence during her crisis, his immediate access to her financial accounts. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying conversations and moments from the past 2 years, looking for signs I had missed. I remembered how Marcus had systematically built a relationship with my mother, how he had encouraged her to make him the primary beneficiary of her will, how he had convinced her to give him access to her accounts. I thought about how he had managed her investments, moving money around in ways that were difficult to track. The next morning, I called my mother's doctor and asked if I could get copies of her medical records. The doctor was hesitant but eventually agreed, given that I was her daughter and the circumstances of her death had been unclear. When I reviewed the records, I found notes about the doctor's suspicions regarding poisoning, and their frustration at not being able to identify the cause or the substance involved. I started researching different types of poisons, focusing on ones that would cause the symptoms my mother had experienced. I learned about substances that could be administered gradually over time, that would cause organ failure and neurological symptoms, that would be difficult to detect in standard toxicology tests. The more I read, the more convinced I became that my mother had been murdered. But I needed proof. I couldn't go to the police with just suspicions and internet research. I decided to play along with Marcus's romantic pursuit while secretly investigating his background and his actions during my mother's illness. I agreed to start dating him again, telling him that I had realized how much I missed him and that maybe my mother would want us to find happiness together. Marcus was overjoyed by my change of heart. He became even more attentive and romantic, planning elaborate dates and talking about our future together. He said he wanted to marry me as soon as it felt appropriate, that he wanted us to start fresh in a new home, maybe even start a family. All the while, I was documenting our conversations, taking photos of anything that seemed relevant, and trying to access information about his financial activities. It was difficult and emotionally exhausting to pretend to love him while suspecting him of murdering my mother. But I was determined to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I started going through my mother's papers more carefully, looking for anything that might provide evidence of Marcus's true intentions or activities. What I found was devastating. Hidden in my mother's home office, I discovered documents showing that Marcus had been systematically draining her accounts for months before her death. He had been moving money to offshore accounts, liquidating investments, and forging her signature on numerous financial documents. He had essentially stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars while she was alive, and her death had given him access to everything else. I also found a small vial hidden in the back of Marcus's medicine cabinet, behind some over-the-counter medications. The vial was unmarked, but it contained a clear liquid that I carefully collected in a separate container. I had it tested privately, and the results confirmed my worst fears. It was a rare poison that could be administered in small doses over time, causing exactly the symptoms my mother had experienced. With this evidence, I finally went to the police. Detective Rodriguez was the lead investigator assigned to the case, and she took my concerns seriously. She ordered my mother's body to be exhumed for more extensive toxicology testing, and the results confirmed the presence of the poison in her system. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been purchasing the poison online using false identities and having it delivered to various locations. The financial investigation uncovered the full extent of Marcus's theft. He had been planning this for years, systematically targeting wealthy, lonely women and building relationships that would give him access to their money. My mother wasn't his first victim, though she was certainly his most lucrative. The police found evidence of similar schemes in other states, other women who had died under mysterious circumstances after marrying men who matched Marcus's description. When the police arrested Marcus, he initially tried to maintain his innocence, claiming that he had genuinely loved both my mother and me, that any financial irregularities were misunderstandings or coincidences. But faced with the overwhelming evidence, he eventually confessed to poisoning my mother and stealing her money. He showed no remorse, only anger at being caught and frustration that his plan to marry me and potentially repeat the process had been disrupted. The trial was a media sensation. The story of the man who had married his girlfriend's mother for money, murdered her, and then tried to seduce the daughter back was exactly the kind of shocking crime that captures public attention. I had to testify about our relationship, about my mother's symptoms and death, about Marcus's attempts to rekindle our romance. It was humiliating and painful, but I was determined to see justice done. Marcus was convicted of first-degree murder and multiple counts of financial fraud. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, he finally showed some emotion, but it wasn't remorse for his crimes. Instead, he seemed angry and bitter, claiming that my mother had been happy during their marriage and that he had given her more love and attention than she had ever received before. The whole experience has left me with trust issues that I'm still working through in therapy. I struggle with the fact that I was so completely deceived by someone I loved, that I ignored red flags and warning signs that seem obvious in retrospect. I feel guilty for introducing Marcus to my mother, for not protecting her from someone who was using her loneliness and desire for love against her. But I also feel proud that I was able to find the truth and bring him to justice. My mother deserved better than to die alone and afraid, poisoned by someone she trusted completely. She deserved to live out her retirement years in peace and happiness, maybe finding real love with someone who valued her for who she was rather than what she owned. I've learned that evil can wear a charming face, that people we trust completely can harbor the darkest intentions, and that love can be weaponized by those who understand how to manipulate our deepest needs and desires. I've also learned that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, that I can survive betrayal and loss and still fight for what's right. The money that Marcus stole has been largely recovered and returned to my mother's estate, which means it's now mine. I've used some of it to establish a foundation in my mother's name that provides support for elderly people who might be vulnerable to financial exploitation. I want her death to mean something, to help protect other people from predators like Marcus. I still have nightmares sometimes about that last conversation with my mother, when she told me how lucky she was to have Marcus. I wish I could go back and warn her, could make her see what he really was before it was too late. But I can't change the past. All I can do is make sure that her story serves as a warning to others, and that Marcus never has the chance to hurt anyone else again. The hardest part is accepting that the man I once loved never really existed. The Marcus I fell for was a carefully constructed persona designed to gain my trust and access to my family. The real Marcus was a cold, calculating killer who saw my mother and me as nothing more than opportunities for financial gain. That realization has been more devastating than the betrayal itself, because it means that some of my most cherished memories were built on lies. But I'm healing, slowly but surely. I'm back in therapy, I'm rebuilding my relationship with David, who has been incredibly understanding and supportive throughout this ordeal, and I'm learning to trust my instincts again. I'm also working with law enforcement to help identify other victims of Marcus and people like him, using my experience to help protect vulnerable people from similar predators. Standing on those courthouse steps after his sentencing, holding that envelope full of evidence that had brought him down, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. My mother's death had been avenged, and Marcus would never hurt anyone else again. It doesn't bring her back, but it gives her death meaning and ensures that her story might save other lives. That's the shocking truth about my mother's new husband. He was never a husband at all, just a predator who used love as a weapon and marriage as a tool for murder. But in the end, love won anyway, because my love for my mother gave me the strength to fight for justice, no matter how much it cost me.